Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. My name is Aaron, although dubbed the Galactic Daddy thanks to Jamie. I'm glad to be back, and I'm glad to be here with Jamie once more.
Hey, folks.
So today we're going to be doing the Praetorian Guard helmet as seen in the Mandalorian Season 3. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler. It's been out for a while now. What did you think about these guys, Jamie?
Yeah, these guys have been all over the internet, and honestly, out of all of the new armor that we saw in Season 3, this may well be my favorite.
It was very easy to model. It's got, a lot of basic shapes, not a lot of details. I just wish they were cooler in the show. They're there to tag team, like 3-on-1, our boy Paz, and then just get juked by Grogu.
Yeah, it's not really a good look when you get beat up by a baby.
Yeah, but we can't deny they have a cool looking helmet, and we're going to be making it today. So we're going to be starting out with a raw 3D print. I offer these in the shop as well if you want to follow along and do this project yourself. You'll notice it looks a little bit funny. We have separated out the center nose.
Yeah, why is that?
We did that for a few reasons, mostly to make it easier to print. For a lot of those helmets with a big center nose, like down the middle, it can and often does fail when it's 3D printing. Things like Bo-Katan, the Armorer, they both have those kind of center nose triangles or protrusions, and they'd have to be held up by support only, and oftentimes they will fall off or shift midway through. So separating out the nose, we can avoid that and get a nice base print to work with, and then stick on the nose later.
Yeah, and we'll be going through some techniques on how to make that as seamless as possible.
So the first thing we want to do is start to fill out those 3D printer lines so that we have a nice smooth surface for painting. Now this helmet is very glossy in the show, and to get a good gloss finish, you need that base coat to be as smooth as possible. So how are you doing that, Jamie?
I like to start off with my classic technique of just using a UV reactive resin, and that will just allow me to control a lot of where this is laid down and instantly harden it just using this UV floodlight. That means I can focus on some of the heavier, more worn parts, such as the top of a dome, and I can make sure that it doesn't pool inside some of the hard, fine lines that you see around this helmet.
It's a great way to fill in a lot of the 3D print lines pretty quickly, so long as you're using proper PPE. And what does that look like?
Well, you always need to make sure to be using a proper mask. Now, that is a mask that is designed for dealing with fumes. We use 3M masks with the pink filters that will allow you to actually be safe using a lot of these techniques, but then also some standard nitrile gloves just to make sure that you aren't touching any of this. And to make sure that those around you are safe. We also include an air filter in the area just to make sure that everyone is healthy when we're working on these projects.
Right. And this is like SLA 3D printing resin, and it smells pretty bad. So if you're going to do this, do it in either a well-ventilated area and use the proper PPE. So now that you've got that first coat down, it's probably a little bit slimy, right?
Yeah, we want to make sure that when we start sanding this, we aren't gumming up our sandpaper or any sort of implement that we use. So I just get a entire bath of IPA, some 99% IPA solution, and I just clean this thing all the way off until all of that tackiness goes away, and we're left with what feels like just a nice plastic with no residue on it.
But the next step of this build is going to be sanding. It's basically unavoidable for any kind of 3D printed project, but there are ways we can expedite it. So what are you doing here?
So I start off with a really rough grid of sandpaper because what we want to do is just rapidly get off any of the burrs, any of the zits, any of the elements on this print that just are imperfect, because at the end of this, we want to try to get this as perfect as possible. So I'll do a rough sand across the entire body using this hand sander and some, around 60 to 80 grit sandpaper, and just get a rough sand, just a good base to fill in the most major of gaps, layer lines, and anything like that. And then coat the entire thing with some filler primer just to fill in any of those smaller areas.
A warning for those at home: when using such a low grit sandpaper, make sure you're not going all the way down to the 3D print, because a 60 grit pad of sandpaper on a mouse sander is really going to shred that 3D print very quickly. So you want to only be sanding the top layer of resin until you have a smooth surface. So that 2-in-1 filler is going to do a great job at filling in a lot of those rough sanded lines, but you're also going to be doing another technique here, something that's a little bit newer to us. What is that?
So I'm going to be using a combination of acetone and Bondo. Now this will thin down the Bondo and allow me to apply a thin layer across the entire helmet. I will also be able to focus on more troublesome spots just by guiding it in with a paintbrush, and I'll just coat the entire thing with this layer. The acetone inside this mix will evaporate very quickly, which will allow you to actually work on this helmet in the next stage very quickly. You can start sanding this within 15 minutes, I'd say.
Typically, we'd apply Bondo just with our fingers, just spreading it around or using the spatula of some kind. What would you say the ratio would be?
The standard ratio we use is about 2 parts Bondo to 1 part acetone.
Yeah.
You just want to thin it, not, mix it thoroughly.
Right. And using that thin mixture really allows you to apply it very thinly, which in turn lets it dry and lets it harden very quickly as well.
And at this point, we really just go through our usual techniques that you see in any of our other videos. And that usually involves us just sanding, spraying down a filler primer, which will allow you to see any further issues, any further trouble spots, applying more Bondo, and repeating until we're happy,
right,
generally to move on to the next fine detail sanding section.
You probably moved up a little bit in grit, right? Or sanded this by hand?
Yeah, that's right. And sanding it by hand is exactly what I did. That allows you to get more control and not apply too much pressure, because the further you get along in this build, the less scratches you want to add. You want to be taking them away.
Right. We usually only go nuts with the mouse sander once in the helmet stage. Maybe twice if we're using like a higher grit on it, but hand sanding can't be beat for the amount of control and the amount of details you can capture.
Yeah, sorry folks. Hand sanding has to be done.
Now, like we mentioned earlier, glosses in particular need a very smooth base coat underneath them to properly reflect the light. If there's a lot of lines or something in there, it will distort that light. You'll be able to see them in the reflection very easily. So how are we going to get a gloss smooth finish?
So we like to use a wet sanding process. I start off usually with a 400 grit. Now this 400 grit is actually still good at getting some of the imperfections on the surfaces away. You're not even trying to polish it yet. You're trying to just get everything as standardized and smooth across the whole surface. So really pay attention to your 400 grit. That is the last real chance you get to refine your lines and take off any terrible burrs or any sort of print lines.
Especially with the 2-in-1 filler, some parts of it can be like fuzzy if the nozzle sputs a little bit. You definitely want to sand that off at this stage, because when we move up in grits, like to 1,000 grit, it's not going to be able to take as much of that material off.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. You want to start refining your shape and your finish directly after this. So we go from this 400 all the way up to an 800, and you're just polishing the entire thing, just really focusing on those surfaces, especially the main flat unfeatured surfaces, which will really show off the polish later. That's where you want to give the most attention to. Once you're done with your 800, we even move on to a 1,000 grit if you really want to get that nice shine.
So now that we've got the base helmet and the nose all polished smooth, it's time to attach them. You're going to be using some CA glue and some activator here, right?
Yeah, that's the classic combination. We want to marry these together as close as possible. And at that point, there will be a seam, and we want to try to make this as seamless as possible. So I first apply a thin layer of Bondo just to see how much of a gap there is. And then I really thickly apply that Bondo just on those seams. And that will allow me to have enough material to work down so I can marry these two pieces together seamlessly.
I think this is the way to do it too. If you had glued on that nose earlier in the process, it's much more prone to accidental snaps or kind of just popping off, like during the sanding process, for example.
Oh yeah, definitely. And when you're moving a helmet around so much when you're sanding it, it's hard to keep track of these things. And that is a very long anchor point that will very easily snap.
Yeah, so it's a lot easier to sand and smooth it all with the nose still separated, and then kind of work together once they're all smooth.
So at this point, depending on how good your connection is, there might be a step between the main helmet and the nose. And we want to make this as seamless as possible. So what I like to use in these circumstances is a detail sander, which is essentially a belt sander attached to a stick. And that will allow me to sand down the step and marry the two so that they are as seamless as possible. Then finishing it up with a engineer's rasp, which is just a big thick file. so I can get those shapes as close as possible to each other.
And you just used a little bit of Bondo to smooth over any gap or any ridge that might be left.
Yeah, you'll definitely be ruining some of your perfect finish, but you can localize this to one specific area, which will just enable you to focus there on resanding that up to 1000 grit. Exactly. It didn't take long to get this up to where I wanted it, and then I just apply another layer of filler primer just to ensure that I know that everything has the same finish.
So now that we've got our helmet assembled, smoothed, we're ready to paint. I can see here you're using a Rust-Oleum Apple Red. I think it's a very good color choice for this. Do you have any tips for painting this helmet?
Yeah, so we want to make sure after putting all of this effort in that we keep this helmet as smooth as possible. So with that in mind, we all know that when you spray some spray paint, there's a good chance there'll be little blobs flying out from the previous time you sprayed. Mm-hmm. To avoid that, we aim the spray can away from the helmet first and glance it over the helmet so that you start and stop the spray not on the helmet, and you do coats that gradually overlap the whole helmet at about 10 to 12 inches away. That is the sweet spot so that you're applying a nice smooth coat, but not applying anything like grit or allowing it to dry in the air before it lands on your helmet.
Those sputters and bubbles can really wreak havoc on a smooth helmet like this.
Yeah, and if that happens, you will have to go back to the drawing board and start sanding all over again, and we are done with that.
So this is a nice red, but it lacks the shiny gloss that the Praetorians have. We're going to be using a product called 2K Clear Coat from SprayMax to give this thing a nice, solid, clear coat that is actually hard enough to withstand scratches. And they use it on cars, for example. If you look outside at your car, you'll see it has a nice glossy coat, and that gloss is actually quite hard. It's scratch resistant, but there are also a lot of considerations to take when using this product.
Yeah, this product is dangerous. We like to call it the pirate spray paint because it is covered in skulls.
Literally has a skull on the can, so we want to make sure and treat this appropriately.
Yeah, so what we do is we set up fans, we open up the garage door in this case, and we blow out all of that product outside. We do not want to be breathing this in. We don't want to get it in our eyes or anything, so we are putting on full ventilators, we're putting on eye protection, gloves, we're doing everything we can, including putting air filters all around us and using an ozone filter to clean the air after we use it. This stuff is not good.
So this 2K clear coat is a little bit different from normal spray cans. It is actually a two-part mixture that we need to kind of break the seal on. There's a little red cap on the top. You take that off, put it on a pin in the bottom, and actually smack it down like you're activating a mortar or something like that. That is going to mix in the hardener into this gloss that actually kind of does a chemical reaction that actually hardens it instead of a typical gloss that kind of just dries. This is actually a chemical process happening really over the course of a week.
Yeah, in fact, this stuff, after that week, you're able to properly polish whatever you sprayed with it. The coat is like glass.
After about 48 hours, the can is basically useless because of that hardener mixing in with the rest of the can. That's why you'll see another helmet in the background. We wanted to make as much use of this can as we could because once those 48 hours are up, it's like a $20, $30 can of spray paint is useless.
You want to make sure that you're getting as much use out of this can as possible.
Right.
So after about 48 hours, we are comfortable enough that any further touches to this helmet will not cause imperfections. You want to make sure that this fully cures after all of this work.
Right. I'd say it cures to about 95% of its hardness over 48 hours with just the remaining 5% over the next 5 days or so. So we felt comfortable enough to work with it to get this last part on while that was hardening. So after the weekend of this thing curing with the ozone generator trying to get rid of the smell, we're ready to put on the visor to this thing, make it so people can't see into the helmet, but that you can still see out. We're going to be using a Hobart face shield for that, tracing it out with this included template in the files. Kind of gives a rough shape of the visor that you need.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that you're using as big of a Hobart face shield as you've got because, as you can see, this is a huge visor.
It's got a very big T, capital T, big font. I'm going to be cutting that out with some tin snips, I believe, right?
Yeah, that's right. This material is pretty hard. You just want to make sure that you are cutting it as close to that line as possible, and you can trim it away later to make it fit as snugly as you want.
And on the inside of the helmet, there is this ridge that this visor actually slots into. So there's not any glue necessary to hold the visor in place. There is something unique to this helmet though, and that's the little visor bridge at the bottom of this helmet.
Yeah, so that will attach to 3 points. It'll attach to both sides of the mandibles, and it will attach to the nose in the middle. Now, because we have a visor there, we just want to make sure that we drill a hole through the visor that will keep it in place, and it keeps it in place very well. What I do is I apply the visor onto the guides, hold that all in place, and slot in this bridge and just apply the standard combination of super glue and activator, and that will instantly bond it in place. And here we have it.
Yeah, that bridge kind of does a great job of combining the nose. You know, helmets like Mando, those spots can be flexible and kind of prone to breaking. So this little bridge, I think, does a great job at kind of unifying all 3 parts of the face. But yeah, like you said, with this visor in place, we are finished with this helmet. Now, we're going to wait a few more days for this thing to finish curing completely, and then probably buff it out with a little bit of a, what would we use? Like a
proper car polish, honestly. This is a car automotive spray paint and clear coat, so you will be able to use standard car polishes to get this as perfect of a shine as you want.
We'll want to get all the fingerprints off before we hang it up on the wall. But this thing is looking great. I wish we could have got a different base print. There's a little bit of a lifting up in the middle of the eyes, but I mean, I think it's okay.
He's just really sad he got beaten up by a child.
I know, right? You know, he was feeling confident after the 3v1 and just got juked by a baby. Well, Jamie, any final thoughts on this helmet before we put it away?
Well, this helmet has really kindled my love for this design, especially how it relates to somewhere between the Royal Guard of the original trilogy to the Praetorian Guard that we see in Snoke's throne room. I love that middle point between them, and I would definitely like to see the rest of the armor in the future.
Was that a hint of something to come?
I don't know, was it?
We'll just go ahead and say it. We are working on the armor files for this, but looking at them, we kind of got some glimpses of the transition between Empire to First Order. Some of the parts, they're just reusing First Order TK parts. I like how that kind of shows the transition from Royal Guard to like Snoke's Praetorian Guard.
Yeah, it's a really cool design, and I love the combination as well as the new pieces. It really stands out with all of these fabric flowing. It's really cool designs and really cool weaponry.
I say I like these more than Snoke's Praetorian Guard helmets.
His dance team?
Yeah, this one's got a sweet like Greek feel almost to it for me. Big fan of it. I love how it came out. So like I said, we're also selling DIY kits of this helmet if you want to complete a project like this yourself. We also sell the 3D files if you want to 3D print this yourself on the shop, and they're currently in the Patreon rewards as well. Thank you all for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you're feeling confident enough to take on a project like this yourself. And as always, I hope to see you again in the next video.